fleet out there of generators that are going to be receiving some stricter regulations, and some of those coal plants will shut down. Some may clean up their plants, but wind is going to displace, wind and other renewables are going to displace some of these older generating units. Okay, here's what I said. There's economic development example. I'm going to run through. I know someone's going to cover economic development issues in detail, but just to show you a quick wind farm projection for a plant that was constructed in 2009. Took 10 months to construct it. It was 100 megawatts, 67 turbines, 179 construction jobs. It's a pretty big deal, even though it was for temporary jobs. When you're talking construction jobs, a lot of money, over $12 million. It's important to notice the aggregate concrete rebar amount, which is $4.5 million on this particular project, and it also relates to the $7 million road contract. That's real important because most of that, especially the aggregate and concrete rebar amounts, are purchased locally. You're not going to truck in from anywhere any long distance these types of things. It's just not economically feasible when there are these companies within your state, probably relatively close to the location, the site. So it's a big selling point to say, look, you're going to help these businesses out. In this particular example, I can't tell you exactly what the permanent jobs, but just based on what I've seen with other jobs, it could be around 10 permanent jobs. Okay, moving forward, and go to the next slide. What do we need to do? One of the key things is to improve the transmission infrastructure needs. We talked about this. The transmission system in the United States is underbuilt, especially for renewable energy development. It's problematic for developers. They need to be building near some of these high energy transmission lines and be able to tie in without too much expense on their own part. If it's very hard to access transmission, then they can't get their projects done because of the cost. Also, if you don't have enough transmission, the prices in those areas, not just renewables, but the price of any energy being delivered into those areas when those lines are constrained, rise dramatically. So the prices are higher there. So if you want to sell renewables into those areas, they may be very reluctant to purchase them because of the higher prices that they're going to have to pay because of the lack of transmission. I've said this a few times, but transmission needs to be built to comply with the state laws. And very positive development is the PJM. As I said, the transmission grid operator and planner is studying how to consider these policy initiatives, renewables, in its transmission planning process. Right now, they do not do that. So they really don't think about renewables right now. When they build a transmission line, they're really only thinking about reliability. But if they incorporate renewables in their studies, then it's quite feasible that you'll see some transmission lines that are being built, at least in part because of the need to comply with these state requirements. A very important study that was conducted by NREL, Department of Energy, NREL, National Renewable Energy Laboratories, did a study, a comprehensive study. In all of their scenarios on their study, they determined that the expense of expanding the transmission grid really represents a small portion of the annualized costs for wind. So even though it would require additional transmission, it's a small piece of that. So it's, my question is, why don't you do it if it's going to make a big difference in getting wind developed? EWIDS is sort of the short name of that study, and they found that extending the transmission system, building it out more, is actually going to help the issue of the variability of wind, because if the wind's not blowing in western Pennsylvania, it might be blowing in western Ohio, and they're on the same, basically transmission-wise. So you get the benefit of the wind in Ohio, but maybe not the benefit at that particular time of the wind in Pennsylvania. But this decreases the concerns that these operators, the transmission grid operators, have with regard to variability of wind. So building out the transmission system could very well help in the area of variability of wind. They also found that in all of their scenarios that they ran, carbon emissions would be reduced in all of those scenarios, and wind would displace carbon-based fuels in all of those scenarios. It's a very critical point. It's one of the reasons why we need to do this. Here's one of my big issues. I'm running around to different states, pushing the need for what we call long-term purchase power agreements, PPAs, for wind. And the reason why we need this, there's usually, long-term purchase power agreements, usually 10 to 25 years in length. It's usually between the utility and it's also between the wind developer. The wind developer needs these. They need these for certainty of a income stream so that they can get the financing for their projects. Otherwise, some developers are sufficiently financed or capitalized so that they can build some of their projects maybe without this financing. But most really the developers out there need these to get financing from financial institutions and other investors for their projects. The risk is on the energy developer of these. You'll hear it twisted around sometimes that, oh, you're putting all this burden on the ratepayers. Well, the ratepayers are going to have to pay for this in the long run. But if the project doesn't get developed, the risk is on the developer because they're the ones who invested the money. So ratepayers would never have to pay a penny of that. They only pay if the energy is delivered to them. And if there are cost overruns, well, that's contractual. If there's a price in the contract, the developers have to deliver at that price. So if there are cost overruns, it's the developers that are the ones responsible for paying, and it's going to cut into their profits. So that's a very important point. REC only, or REC and energy purchase power agreement should be approved, in my opinion. These are, in some states, you'll see some REC only contracts, which are renewable energy credits, which are a way to satisfy, in a lot of states, the renewable portfolio standards. But it's also very important that not only the RECs, but the energy from these projects be part of those contracts. So, I'm always pushing for a REC and energy contract, to be that type of scenario to be approved by, and they're usually approved by the state Public Utility Commission, Public Service Commissions. In Virginia, it's the State Corporation Commission. I think it's very important to stress the point is you don't want a utility to just pay any price for this energy. I mean, the utility needs to be prudent. They need to have a process to get, to convince the decision makers. They need to have a process that's reasonable, that's prudent, maybe a very good RFP process where there are multiple developers bidding in and they get the best price out of that process. And I think that's the way you make it cost effective, and it's a reasonable procurement process. And I think that gives evidence that the price was reasonably obtained. And at that point, then, the Commission should be looking at this in a very positive way. And I also, what seems to stop utilities from entering these contracts is they're very concerned about cost recovery. I told you they're very risk averse. It's very important that these commissions allow for the cost recovery of these contracts. They've entered into them prudently. They can take a look at these contracts. Prices of wind contracts are clear in the sense that there's a purchase price. They can factor that out if there's going to be any kind of increase to the utility ratepayers, the commission would have that information. They could determine if it's reasonable, but then they should allow the cost recovery. They know what it is over the full term, even if it's 20 years. They'll know what the price is over that 20-year period. So that's very important, and you know, that's a key factor when you go into these states, trying to convince the commissions, as was not the case in Virginia, but convince the commissions that they should allow cost recovery for these contracts, where these deals aren't going to get done and wind isn't going to build out as it should. I'm just going to run through this real quick. There's certain federal tax credits that are available to the wind industry. The information's on the slide, but it's important to know that the most important one, I think, to a lot of the wind developers is this investment tax credit, especially when they can turn it into a grant, the third bullet, that is actually a grant that's paid up front by the U.S. Department of Treasury. So a developer that, let's say, is not highly capitalized can take advantage of that, and they may not have, the tax credit may not be that big a deal to them because they may not have the income to use the tax credit. Unfortunately, the ITC is set to expire at the end of this year. It's the typical case. I think every year when we would be doing this type of presentation, that's what we're going to be saying. It gets extended year after year. It might be less likely this year given the political situation in Washington right now. But in the long run, we really need to do, really need to do these things on a long-term basis, get Congress to extend these things for a long term. And at the very end, I was just given the cue that we're done, almost done. Here's just other opportunities. I'll only talk about these the last four are going to be discussed today. The Midwest wind, PJM onshore wind, and offshore wind. These are just issues I'm bringing up because do you get your wind from the Midwest, where some people claim it's a lot cheaper? PJM onshore wind, which is what we're trying to do and develop in this, or do you get it offshore? And that's a question that's being addressed in a lot of the states through legislation. Just something to be aware of. You can look at this information in the package. I think you were given a CD of my presentation, but this is just a little information on my organization. Here are some of the members of MARIC. They're large developers and turbine manufacturers, public interest groups like both OEA and Future. Very good members, and we actually have a few new members that are not listed here, but we're a growing organization. And again, you can look at the policy objectives of MARIC, but very consistent with what I just talked about in this presentation. Thank you very much, and I don't know if I have any time for questions. Courtney, do I have time? Okay, one or two questions. Does anybody have a question? Yes.
Given the political climate in Virginia, do you see changes from the voluntary to mandatory?
I'm not sure. Yeah, I certainly know about what's going on there, but I'm not sure I'm qualified to talk about that. Other than to say, I know it would be a very difficult push to get that done. There's a lot of political clout that doesn't want that, and so I think it's going to be a difficult push. But personally, I think it's something that at least at some point should be considered, maybe in some kind of orchestrated way to try to get that done, because it would make a difference. You can